Okay. Oh, wait, we don't want to see this. There we go. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about some of what we call the accessory structures of the eye. So these structures are going to be in the near vicinity of our eye. This is another one of our special senses is the eye for vision. And so we're going to talk about, because some of you might be like, well, why the heck do I have eyebrows? What do I need eyelashes for? All right, and tear ducts and all that fun stuff. So when we talk about the accessory structures of the eye, we're going to talk about a bunch of different muscles that help to move the eye around. All right, eyebrows, eyelids, eyelashes, and then the conjunctiva, which is the covering of our eye, and then our lacrimal glands. So the eyebrows we saw when we were talking about the skull there, on the frontal bone, are going to sit along the superciliary edges, or what we call the supraorbital ridge. And that's going to be along the top margin of the orbit there. And a big purpose for the eyebrows is to prevent sweat from dripping into your eyes, but also we'll use the eyebrows to help with some of our ways of communicating with one another without even talking. I mean, one of the more famous facial expressions that we've seen is the people's eyebrow, excuse me, where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, when he used to be a WWF wrestler, would raise the one eyebrow. And of course, when you see some folks raise both their eyebrows in surprise over something, and I can't remember, there was a comedian that could move his eyebrows together or one at a time to certain music, which I thought was funny. But anyways, all right, that's the eyebrows. Your eyelashes, all right, you will see them on the edges of your eyelids here. And again, your eyelashes prevent things from actually getting into your eye. And so we'll see, all right, how these type of structures, we just talked about some of the different tactile receptors in lecture and some of their purposes there. But one of the tactile receptors we'll see around the follicles there, the hair root plexes there, are located along the eyelashes. So when something brushes your eyelash, you immediately blink. And again, that blink reflex prevents things from getting into your eyes. So if you're ever looking at yourself in the mirror and you're checking out your eyes, eyebrows, eyelashes, you'll notice you have two eyelids. You have an inferior and a superior eyelid. We refer to those as the palpebrae, but for right now, I'll refer to them as the eyelids. All right. So when we're talking about our eyelids, we'll see how at the actual, all the structures involved with the eyelids, we have this one structure which is called the tarsal plate. And when we're labeling the eye, I'll show you on our model the tarsal plate. But the tarsal plate, it has a kind of a stiff kind of configuration. We refer to that as the fibrous core there. And then surrounding, all right, the actual orbit there is the orbicularis oculi muscle. And so essentially our eyelids are made up of the tarsal plate, which is going to kind of give it a little bit of shape, support. And then over that, all right, we'll see the orbicularis oculi muscle. And then we'll cover that with some of the skin there. Now, what opens up our eye is a muscle called the levator palpebrae superioris. And so what this will do is this one structure called the palpebral fissure. That's if you're closing both of your eyes, and you can look in a mirror and do this. When you close your eyes, you'll see a slit there. And that's the palpebral fissure. So when you are stimulating the levator palpebrae superioris, and look at the name, that name of that muscle tells you exactly what it's going to do. It's going to elevate your upper eyelid, opening your eye. And what we'll see is, all right, when that muscle is activated, the palpebral fissure, that opening will enlarge, but you'll notice how your upper eyelid and your lower eyelid will meet each other on the medial and lateral sides there, and where they join together. All right, if we're on the nose or the medial side, we refer to that as the medial palpebral commissure, and then out toward your ear, we have our lateral palpebral commissure. And when we're looking at the medial commissure, and I'll show you this in a picture here, you'll notice this pink structure. And some folks have described it as when they're waking up in the morning and they're cleaning out their eyes or they're rubbing their eyes, this area usually gets the junk or gunk collected in it. And that structure is called the lacrimal caruncle. And that's this area in which a lot of the debris from your eye will collect overnight. We'll also see there in our tarsal plate, we have our tarsal glands, which are sebaceous glands. As you recall, sebaceous glands are going to produce a thicker secretion compared to our sweat glands, the sebum there. This secretion, right, again, helps to lubricate our eye. We need, and we'll talk about this, we need to make sure that we're constantly providing lubrication for our eye. One, we don't want it to dry out, but also, if you think about it, your eyelids are sliding over the actual eye quite a bit. So we want to make sure that we're able to protect that area there. So when those glands get an infection, we call that a chalazion. And you'll notice also, if you've ever gotten an infection of the sweat glands there near your eye, all right, you've heard of the term a sty, and you'll see this reddish structure, right, usually in and around some of the eyelashes there. And so we refer to that infection as a sty. So another accessory structure of the eye is the conjunctiva. And this is the covering of your actual eye itself and some of the surfaces of your eyelid. And it's transparent, which makes sense. You wouldn't want it to be opaque because then light couldn't enter the eye. And the conjunctiva is made up of stratified columnar epithelium. Now, like I said, well, not recently, but back in the beginning of this course here, we were talking about the different tissues in chapter 5. Right, stratified columnar epithelium, right, is going to be seen in support structures here. So the conjunctiva and its transport appearance, that part of the conjunctiva that covers the white of your eye, we refer to as the ocular conjunctiva. And then we'll also see how the conjunctiva will then start to cover the internal surface of the eyelid. That's referred to as the palpebral conjunctiva. And where they both come together is called the conjunctival fornix there. And again, in these structures, we are going to see glands, all right, specifically unicellular goblet cells that, again, will help to lubricate and moisten the eye. And in these areas too, we're going to see numerous blood vessels, all right, to help provide, all right, the necessary nutrients and ingredients here for those tissues here. Now, one of the things that you need to understand is that the conjunctiva does not cover the cornea. And so therefore, okay, when we get into refraction, which we'll talk about in lecture, therefore the conjunctiva, since it doesn't cover the cornea, will not interfere with how light enters your eye. There's a concept out there about refraction, the bending of light rays, and the cornea will bend the light rays slightly, right? But the conjunctiva, because it does not cover the cornea, offers no, what's the word I want to use? No role in what happens to the light as it enters into the eye. So of course, when this structure becomes inflamed, right, we refer to it as pink eye, or more commonly as the conjunctivitis there. So let's look at all these structures in which I was just kind of going over with you. Let's start over here on the left side. Right, obviously, you can tell here are the eyelashes here, right, on both the superior and inferior palpebrae here. And you'll notice this opening here is the palpebral fissure. So when your eyes are closed, it'll have more of a slit-like appearance. Here is your pupil. Here is the iris. We'll talk about that. The white of your eye is known as the sclera here. And so where your superior palpebrae and your inferior palpebrae come together and meet each other by the nose, that's the medial palpebral commissure. And you'll notice you have this pinkish structure here. That's the lacrimal caruncle, or caruncle, excuse me. So that's where you're going to be finding a lot of debris that collects here. So we'll come over here to the right side of our page. Here you can see your eyebrow, right? And then you'll notice where the superior palpebra and the inferior palpebra come together on the lateral portion. That's going to be our lateral palpebral commissure here. So the white part of the eye is the sclera, and you'll see, this is where, all right, the conjunctiva covers the actual eye itself. Now you cannot see the palpebral conjunctiva because that's going to be on the inside of the eyelids, and we'll show you those when we're labeling some structures here. Let's zoom in here a little bit. Okay, so part of what you can see here, again, this is a sagittal cut through the eye itself. And just here's a little bit of a perspective here. Here's that opening to your eye, the palpebral fissure, superior palpebra and the inferior palpebra. And you'll notice just on the inside here, right here you have those tarsal glands there that are going to be constantly producing, all right, the secretion there, the sebum there, to help lubricate and moisten the eye here. On the center here, you can note, I don't know if I can zoom in anymore, all right? This line that you can see that's running right through here is the tarsal plate. Excuse me. And that's going to provide support to the actual eyelid itself. All right, here's the orbicularis oris muscle that is found around your eye. And that's the muscle that you are going to contract when you're squinting. All right, we'll also have a muscle that's attaching here to the superior eyelid, and that's the levator palpebrae superioris. We'll talk about some of the other muscles in and around the eye. All right, but you can see you have that covering to the sclera here, and that's going to be our ocular conjunctiva. And then you're going to have on the inside of our eyelids here, all right, also that covering, that's the palpebral conjunctiva. But where they both come together and meet, this little corner here and here, that's the conjunctival fornix. All right, where both the ocular and the palpebral conjunctiva come together and meet one another. All right. There we go. So one of the things I love talking about when dealing with the eye is, why do we cry? What's the purpose? What happens? Where do our tears go? Where do they come from? Well, the tears are mainly going to come from the lacrimal apparatus. And what's the purpose? It's not just to make tears, all right? I mean, there is that too, and we'll discuss that, all right? But the whole lacrimal apparatus, all right, is going to make lacrimal fluid, which is going to help lubricate and clean the eye, and it also keeps it moist, all right, so it doesn't dry out. And all of those properties help to protect the eye. And so in our lacrimal fluid that's produced by the lacrimal gland, which is located in the superior lateral portion of your orbit there, right, that's going to be controlled by cranial nerve number 7. All right, that's going to help to stimulate the secretion for that. But the purpose of the lacrimal fluid, the primary, again, like I mentioned, to help lubricate, clean, and moisten the eye and protects it from infections. All right, but the primary ingredient in the lacrimal fluid is water. We'll also see some sodium, but the two big ingredients here are antibodies for the immune system, but also lysozyme, and that's an enzyme that is highly effective in killing bacteria. So it helps, both the antibodies and the lysozyme help to destroy any type of microbes that might be trying to infiltrate, all right, our body, right? Because keep in mind, and you'll talk about this more in 211, all right, you have an innate immune system, and then you have a cell-mediated portion of the immune system. The innate immune system is like your skin. Your skin is a barrier. It's a physical barrier between the external environment and the internal environment of your body. And so microbes are constantly trying to find ways around that. And so one of the ways would be through your eye, through your ear, okay, your nose. So your eye is set up this lacrimal apparatus, right, for several purposes, but one of the big purposes is to help defend it against any type of pathogen here. All right, so the lacrimal gland produces, all right, the lacrimal fluid, and every time you blink, you are going to move, all right, the lacrimal fluid across your eye. So you roughly blink about 15 to 20 times per minute. You probably don't notice it, and probably now that you're thinking about it, you're probably blinking more. But every time you do that, just think of it as kind of flushing or moving that lacrimal fluid all around the surface of your eye, so you can actually, clean it and keep it moist and protect it from drying out. So here's what's going to happen. The lacrimal gland, and I've got a picture here that I'll show you in a moment. The lacrimal gland produces the lacrimal fluid. As you're blinking, you move it around the eye, and you move the fluid towards your nose. And you have two holes near your nose, and those are called puncta, right? The lacrimal puncta. You have a superior lacrimal puncta and an inferior lacrimal puncta. All you have to do is look in the mirror and pull your lower eyelid down because it's easier to see. And over there near the lacrimal carbuncle, you're going to see a small black hole there. And that is where your tears, all right, or the lacrimal fluid is going to drain into the lacrimal puncta. And there's a tubular system on the other side of that lacrimal puncta. And so depending on which one we're talking about, all right, we call those a lacrimal cannuliculus. There's another name for it when we do the labeling. I'll show you that in a little bit. All right, but it's just a tube system. And so you have that superior and inferior lacrimal puncta, and then you have the superior and inferior lacrimal cannuliculus that are going to drain into the structure called the lacrimal sac. And that lacrimal sac then empties into the nasal lacrimal duct, which empties that lacrimal fluid into your nasal cavity. And of course, all right, your nasal cavity will then flush that fluid, all right, back down towards the nasal pharynx into your throat, and then you can swallow it down. All right. So if you've ever wondered why, when you are crying, when you get a good cry on, right, or maybe even an ugly cry, right, you might notice that your nose starts to get stuffy. And that's because all of those tears, whatever doesn't fall down on the side of your cheek, all right, is going to flow into the nasal cavity. And we're going to see it drain there. So here we go. Let's take a quick peek here. If you look at our picture, here's our our lacrimal gland on the superior lateral portion of the orbit. And so it's going to produce, all right, all that lacrimal fluid through these ducts, and it'll wash across the eye as you are blinking. And then on the medial portion of your eye, you have your superior and inferior lacrimal puncta, those little black openings there in your eyelid. And then those openings will allow the lacrimal fluid to drain into the superior and inferior, all right, lacrimal cannuliculi, and then they'll drain into the lacrimal sac, down into the nasal lacrimal duct, down into the nasal cavity, mixes up with some of the mucus there, and then you swallow it down and it goes away. All right, so that is the accessory structures of the eye. Now let's get into the nitty gritty and talk about some of the structures of your eye. All right, so keep in mind you have two eyes. I know everyone knows that, but I have to remind some folks, right? Each eye is located in each orbit, and they're surrounded, the eye is surrounded, similar to like the kidneys are surrounded by fat. Well, the eyes are surrounded by what we call orbital fat. I've heard it's also referred to as periorbital fat. But again, some of the functions of adipose tissue includes insulation and cushioning. And that's what the orbital fat does. It helps to pad the eye and protect it so it's not banging around inside of the orbits of your skull. So when we're looking at the eye, it's made up of two cavities. The inside of the eye has two cavities. You have the posterior cavity, and that's everything behind the lens. And then the anterior cavity is everything in front of the lens. Your eye is filled with fluid. Well, I shouldn't say fluid. It's filled with substances, each of these cavities. The anterior cavity is filled with a substance called the aqueous humor. And we call it the circulating aqueous humor because, all right, your eye is constantly going to be producing and draining out the aqueous humor. The aqueous humor is more of like a fluid type of consistency. In the posterior cavity, all right, we have a substance in there called the vitreous humor. And we call it the permanent vitreous humor because you are born with it and it does not go anywhere. It stays there. Now, it's more like a gelatin. So if you, well, I won't bring that up, but if you've ever had Jell-O, all right, or pudding, it's very similar in consistency, all right, to Jell-O or pudding. It helps to keep the eye hold its shape, right? And it will play a role. We'll talk about some of the role it plays when we talk about refraction here. So when we're talking about our eye, the actual wall of the eye, we have three layers, and we call those three layers tunics. The outer layer is the fibrous layer. That's the one that gives a lot of structural support to the eye. Then the middle layer is the vascular layer. That says it all right, vascular layer. A lot of blood vessels will be located there. And then the inner layer is the retina, and that's going to be our neural layer. That's where we're going to see, all right, where our photoreceptors are located, all right, so for vision. So that will happen on the inner tunic there. So in a moment, we're going to go through some of these layers here, but just to kind of give you an idea, so you can see here are the orbits, and this picture doesn't show the periorbital fat, all right, located around the eye, but keep in mind, all of this is just loaded up with fat. You're going to have some of the muscles in there. All right, you can see here at the posterior portion of each eye is the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is sensory only, so it's only going to have sensory neurons located inside here. We have a structure the picture is indicating called the fovea centralis. That is the area where your sharpest vision is going to be located. That's where your cones are located. They're one of the two types of photoreceptors that are in your eye. You have rods and cones, and the cones are for sharp vision, and they're located right there by the fovea centralis. All right, so here you can see all three of our layers here. Our fibrous tunic is the outermost layer. And we've already talked a little bit about it. We talked about the sclera. That's the white of your eye. So when you see the white of your eye, you're actually looking at the fibrous tunic, and also the cornea. That's that transparent structure that sits anterior here to the iris and the pupil there. Deep to that, the middle layer is the vascular tunic. That is made up of the iris, all right, the ciliary body, which helps to change the shape of the lens. And then we actually have this pinkish structure here called the choroid. And then our inner layer is the retina. And then so we'll have both the pigmented layer and the neural layer. And we'll talk more about that later on. All right, so if we move in here a little bit, oh, that's too much. Back out. Here we go. All right, so looking in a little bit closer, I'm not going to run through all this because we'll go through all these structures. All right, you have your anterior cavity up front here. Here's the lens. So everything in front of the lens or anterior to the lens is going to be the anterior cavity. That's filled with the aqueous humor, and that's constantly circulating throughout. Back here is the posterior cavity, and this is where the vitreous humor is. That doesn't circulate. It's always there. It's that clear gelatin-like structure or substance back here. All right, you'll notice in front of the lens, here's the iris, that's the colored portion of your eye, and then you have an opening here, and that's the pupil. All right, if you look up here, the superior portion, here's your ciliary body, and the ciliary body is made up of the ciliary muscle and the ciliary process. We'll talk about that, but the ciliary muscle, when it contracts and relaxes, all right, will actually put tension or release tension on what we call the suspensory ligaments, and these ligaments will manipulate the shape of your lens depending on what you're looking at, so we can focus. Think of it like a lens and a camera, right? When you're trying to focus that, we're going to be manipulating the shape of this. Now, the anterior cavity is made up of two chambers. You have an anterior chamber, which is pretty much everything in front of the iris to the cornea. And then you have a posterior chamber, which is going to be pretty much everything from the opening of the pupil back to this back portion of the lens here. Now that comes into play in a little bit, and we'll talk about that. Going back here to the posterior portion, all right, you'll see, all right, here's our optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. We'll have some blood vessels entering and exiting from the eye here. Here's that foveal centralis. That's where we're going to get our sharp vision here. Where the cranial nerve 2, all right, is formed at the eye, where the blood vessels are entering and exiting, we call that the optic disc. In the optic disc, all right, there are no photoreceptors here. Okay, no photoreceptors, but this is what we look for to see, all right, when we're looking for veins and arteries entering and exiting the eye here. Then we can see the same 3 layers. We'll talk about that. I think I hit it every. Oh, I shouldn't forget about these guys, the sphincter pupillae and dilator muscles here. All right, remember when we talked about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system and how they can manipulate the pupil, the size of the pupil? All right, we said that the sympathetic nervous system is going to make the pupil larger, and the parasympathetic nervous system will constrict the pupil. Well, if you look here, our sphincter pupillae muscle is going to be innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system, and so it's going to make the size of the pupil smaller. The dilator pupillae muscle, right, is located over here, and that is going, I'll show you a much better picture. It's hard to really kind of get a good grasp on this, right, looking at it from this view. But the dilator pupillae muscle is going to be innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to make the diameter of the pupil larger. I think that's it. Oh, and then finally, the scleral venous sinus, this little hole here, basically the purpose of that structure is that aqueous humor that's circulating through, right? That's where the aqueous humor drains out. So the pressure doesn't get too much in here. If you've ever heard of glaucoma, that's when you get an increase in pressure, right, in your eye because you're producing too much aqueous humor and it might not be able to drain out of here. There's 2 types of glaucoma. There's open angle and closed angle, and that just has to do, and there's certain drugs that help with that, but that just helps. That has to do with the amount and the volume of the aqueous humor in that anterior cavity there. All right, so let's walk through each of these layers here. Let's start off with the outermost layer, the fibrous tunic. Remember, this is the one I was telling you about. It's that thick, kind of tough outer layer, right? It's going to support and give shape to the eye here. It's made up of two structures, the sclera, easy to remember, that's the white of the eye, right? And that's going to be made up of that dense irregular connective tissue, right? And so this is going to help provide the shape for our eye here. And what is nice about it too is it's an attachment site for the extrinsic eye muscles. Again, those muscles help to move your eye around, looking up, looking down, looking in, looking out, all over the place. So the sclera is, I think of the sclera like a goon on a hockey team. I don't know why I always thought about it, but it's just a tough structure, and it has to carry a lot of when I say responsibility, it's just things get heaped upon it, like attachment for those extrinsic eye muscles. I mean, so we can move the eye around, and it helps to give the eye its shape. I mean, those are two pretty huge and largely important duties for the sclera to undergo when you're trying to discern the function of the eye. Then we have our cornea. All right, the cornea is on the anterior portion of the eye, and it is going to be transparent because we do not want to obstruct the passage of light as it's entering into the eye, right? Referred to as the window there. All right, we'll see that there are a couple layers here to the cornea. The outer layer is made up of simple squamous epithelium, and the inner layer is made up of simple squamous epithelium, and then the outer layer is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and then sandwiched in between is going to be collagen. And again, that collagen is going to help to offer structural support to the cornea. But there's not going to be any blood vessel located in the cornea. So of course, the only way, all right, for the cornea, all right, to receive nutrients and get rid of waste is through that process of diffusion. And so that's where a lot of that lacrimal apparatus comes into play, because as that lacrimal fluid is washing across the surface of your eye, and as your eyes are blinking, right, that helps to diffuse some of that nutrients into the cornea and help to get rid of any waste that the cells have produced there. It does play a role in the refraction of light. More on that when we get into that portion of the physiology on the light refraction. Okay, basically, what does that mean? All right, when we talk about refraction, it refracts light. It bends some of the light rays that are coming into your eye. Okay, the second layer, or the middle layer, is the vascular tunic. All right, that makes sense, vascular, so it should have lots of blood vessels there. But not only that, we're going to include lymph vessels. All right, so this layer is going to have all the vessels, and we're going to have some of our intrinsic muscles. Now, when we get into the intrinsic muscles, this is going to play a role in, all right, the shape of the lens here. We'll talk about it. So there's three parts to this. We have the choroid, the ciliary body, and then the iris. The choroid, this is where we're going to see more so in the posterior portion of the eye, the wall of the eye. All right, we saw this deep to the vascular tunic here, but this is going to contain, all right, a high vascularity, so we can provide plenty of nutrients for the neural layer, or the retina there. We'll also see melanocytes here, all right, and you know their job is to produce melanin to absorb any extra light that's bouncing around, because that's what happens. Light enters in through the pupil, and so it's going to strike the retina, right? And the light will sometimes start to bounce around inside, and so the melanin helps to absorb that extra light, so we aren't, causing any damage to any structures, but also so we can get a clear picture. Now on to the ciliary body. Let's talk about how we are going to manipulate the shape of the lens so you can focus in on things. If I'm looking at the mountains in the distance and then I look down at my feet for whatever reason, right, I will need to change the shape of my lens. And so the ciliary body is going to play a role in that. So the ciliary body is made up of the ciliary muscles and the ciliary processes. So the ciliary muscles are smooth muscle, which means we do not have any voluntary control. And so these smooth muscles are going to attach onto what we call the suspensory ligaments. And so the suspensory ligaments attach onto the lens. And so what will happen is when we relax or contract the smooth muscles, we'll alter the shape of the lens so we can focus and see things clearer. The ciliary processes are going to contain the capillaries, which are in charge of producing our aqueous humor, the fluid there. Our third structure, did I hit all the structures? No, yeah. Choroid, all right. Our third structure in the vascular tunic is the iris, all right? You've noticed this because a lot of us will have different color irises from one another, right? And this is when you're talking about someone having blue eyes, actually the correct thing to be saying is, this person has blue irises, right? But the iris is going to be found in the anterior portion here of the actual eye. It contains the smooth muscle, which we'll talk about here in a moment when we talk about the pupil diameter here. Right? It also contains melanocytes, more vessels, and that includes our blood vessels and our lymphatic vessels. And then we're going to see some of our neural structures here, which we'll talk about. So the iris is important because this is, all right, the structure that we use to divide our eye into the two chambers there, all right, of our anterior cavity there. So we have that anterior chamber and the posterior chamber, right? All of this is part of the anterior cavity. Your eye is made up of two cavities, the posterior cavity and the anterior cavity. Our anterior cavity is subdivided into the anterior chamber, and that's going to be found in between the cornea and the iris. And then the posterior chamber will be found between the lens and the iris. And then that opening inside the iris, as you know, is the pupil, and that actually connects the anterior and posterior chamber. And when we talk about how the aqueous humor flows between those two chambers, the pupil plays a role in that because it flows through the pupil from one chamber to the next. So the iris, we talked about how the iris the iris will change size, right, depending on which muscles are going to be contracting and which muscles are relaxing. So the two muscles that we saw on that diagram were the sphincter pupillae muscle and the dilator pupillator muscle. The sphincter pupillae muscle is going to be innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sphincter pupillator muscle will constrict the pupil, and that's due to the ocular motor nerve, cranial nerve 3. The dilator pupillae muscle is going to dilate. Look at the name, how nice. It tells you exactly what it's going to do. The dilator pupillae muscle is going to dilate the pupil, and that's under the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so this is an example of the antagonistic effects that the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system have on one another. So there's a reflex, like when we want to test, all right, how these muscles, or not these muscles, but how our sensory component to our eye is working and the motor component to our eye is working, we utilize the pupillary reflex. And as you recall, in all the reflexes, there's a sensory component and a motor component, always. All right, so when we're going to check the pupillary reflex, it's real simple. I'm going to take a pen light and I'm going to shine it into your eye. All right, so when I do that, if everything is normal, your pupil should constrict, because I've increased the brightness of the light that's coming into your eye. And so when I shine that light into your eye, I am going to test cranial nerve number 2, that's the sensory component. All that sensory nerve information is going to travel on cranial nerve number 2. And then cranial nerve number 3, all right, is going to cause the pupil to constrict, right? And that's going to be stimulating the sphincter pupillae muscle. So I am checking both cranial nerve number 2 and cranial nerve number 3 simply by just shining a light in your eye. And that's what we're seeing here. So our pupillary constriction, when we shine bright light, you notice that the pupil gets smaller, and that's because we're stimulating the parasympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system, right, to affect the sphincter pupillae muscle. And so again, anytime you have sphincter in the name of something, it's going to make an opening smaller. And that's what you're seeing here. All those muscle fibers are contracting to make the pupil smaller. Now, when you're, if I were to somehow be able to look into your pupil in a dark room, all right, you'll notice that the pupil will be much larger because it's trying to let as much light in to your eye as possible to get a clear picture of whatever it's looking at. And so when that's occurring, right, the dilator pupillae muscle is contracting and it's pulling, all right, this middle portion here, that center, outwards. So it makes the pupil larger. All right, our innermost tunic is the retina, also known as the neural or internal tunic. And we have a couple different layers here. We have our pigmented layer, our neural layer. Our pigmented layer is going to be loaded, all right, with our vitamin A here. And we'll talk more about the physiology, what we need vitamin A for, but it's important in phototransduction in our photoreceptors. All right, very, very important. But here in the pigmented layer, this is where we're going to absorb a lot of those light rays that are just bouncing around inside of our eye. The neural layer, this is the big one. This is the layer that houses our photoreceptors, okay? And so the photoreceptors, we'll talk about that whole sensory neuron chain there, right? But we'll have photoreceptors there, and then some of the neurons that are going to be involved in our optic nerve formation there. And so when light enters into the eye, it will interact with the photoreceptors, and then it's going to convert that light energy into action potentials. As we move towards the anterior portion of the posterior chamber there, we have a structure there called the ora serrata. Obviously, serrata is like a serrated edge. So this is the jagged edge here. And this is where we're going to start to transition, all right, between areas of the retina that have photoreceptors and areas that do not. All right, so the non-photosensitive part is closer to the anterior portion of the eye, right? And so we're going to see this area here covering the ciliary body, and then a little bit on the back side of the iris here. So if let me come back and show you. Here we go. Here's the ora serrata. And so you can see there's, all right, this area here, we're not going to see photoreceptors in. So we're going to start to transition. All of this area here will have photoreceptors. Right? But as we get closer towards the lens, we don't see that. So when we talk about the ora serrata, I always refer to it as just, you know, that boundary between areas that you can see and areas that don't allow you to see. So when we're looking at the retina, we are going to see 3 layers inside the neural layer of the retina. All right, the first layer is the photoreceptor layer. That's the outermost layer. All right, then we have the bipolar layer, and it's cool because it's named after the shape of the cell. It's a bipolar cell. All right, so you recall, bipolar cell has 2 processes coming off in opposite directions. The cell body's in the middle. You have an axon going one way and the dendrite going another way. All right, so that's the bipolar layer. That's the middle layer. And then our innermost layer is the ganglion cell layer. Now, the ganglion cell layer, these cells, their axons will eventually form the optic nerve. And it's this cell that is going to allow for action potentials to occur, or those nerve signals there. Some of the other interneurons that you'll see in the area, we'll talk more in detail about these guys, the horizontal cells and the amacrine cells. So this is what we're looking at. Let's zoom in here a little bit. We'll talk more about this in lecture here, but you can see, all right, here we are, here's the retina, right, and all we're going to do is we're just going to take a nice dissection right out of the neural layer here, well, the whole layer, but of the retina, and we'll zoom in here. Okay, so you'll notice, all right, in this outer layer here, this is where we're going to find our photoreceptor cells, our rods and cones. And then we have the next layer here, we have our bipolar cells. And look at the shape of the cells. They are bipolar. There's the cell body. One process is going one way and another process is going the other direction here. These are the bipolar cells. And then you have your ganglion cells. And the ganglion cells are going to be the ones that will eventually form, all right, the optic nerve. And then scattered in between these layers here, you can see the horizontal cell and the amacrine cell. And so light comes in through the pupil, it travels through all of these layers because it's got to get to our photoreceptor cells back here, that inner layer there. All right, well, not inner layer. This is the outermost layer. Okay. So just to review, the photoreceptor cell layer is the outermost layer. That is this layer right here. So that would be over here. Then our ganglion cells will be the innermost layer. They'll be over here. All right, so then after the photoreceptor layer comes the bipolar cell layer. And we're going to see the bipolar cell layer then connect to the ganglion cell layer. So like I said, I'll explain the physiology between the cells in these layers in lecture. All right, so a couple other things that you're going to see inside the eye. All right, we have our optic disc, also known as the blind spot because there are no photoreceptors there. And this is where those ganglion cell axons make a beeline back towards the brain there. And they will be, they form the optic nerve. And then you have your right and left optic nerves that will converge at the optic chiasm. We have another structure called the macula luta. All right, when you're looking at it with an ophthalmoscope, that's that thing that the doctor looks into your eye with. Right, you'll see it look kind of like a yellowish structure. It's normally to the lateral port or side of the optic disc. In the center of the macula luta is the fovea centralis. This is the structure that has the sharpest vision because it has the highest amount of cones present. The cones give you sharpness of vision, and they are the cell that can discern colors. Rods, all right, cannot tell the difference between colors. Rods work the best in dim light, and they have they're not very good. They'll give you a much more of a blurry image, whereas cones work best in I don't want to say bright light, but in ample light, like daylight, and they'll give you sharp vision. Now, where do we find our cones? Primarily at the periphery of the retina. All right, which is good because they work best when we don't have a lot of light being let in. So at night, when you get up to go to the bathroom and you're trying to find your way to through your bedroom or down the hall and you don't want to turn any lights on, you're relying on your rods, all right, to help with that. So here you can see when we're looking on our ophthalmoscope here, easy to find the optic disc, because the optic, just look to see where all the blood vessels in your eye are going to. And they all converge here on the optic disc. This is the blind spot, no photoreceptors here, but this is where all the blood vessels enter and exit, and all the axons from your ganglion cells will converge here. And then on the other side, that's where the optic nerve starts and forms there. So when you go out to the lateral portion, you'll be able to see the fovea centralis here. The macula luta is the outer area here, and then the fovea centralis is dead center. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how we change the shape of the lens, right? Because it can be sometimes a little bit confusing to some folks, right? So when we talk about the lens, obviously its job is to focus the light to make it so you have a sharp image of something. And so in order to do that, we have to change the shape of the lens depending on what we're looking at and where, all right, the distance, how far that structure is away. All right, so the lens, right, no longer has any organelles inside of it. Instead, right, we have a special kind of protein, right, called crystallin, and that is now inside of our lens. Now, when I was in medical school, there was a study going on at one of the hospitals that was close by, in which they were doing research on the lens, and they were trying to see if the lens was like a tree. And you're probably wondering, what the heck is he talking about? What I mean by that is, all right, you know how every year a tree, when it grows, it puts another layer or a ring around the trunk of the tree, right? Well, they were testing that with the lens because it was believed, right, that the lens would do the same thing. And it was because, all right, of the tissue, all right, that made up the lens, that dense fibrous tissue there, that every year it was hypothesized that it was putting another layer on the lens. And to be honest with you, I never I never found out what I don't know why I told you that, but I never found out what the result of that study was, if it was conclusive or not, but I apologize. But I found that to be interesting, and that just reminded me of it. So the job of the lens is to change shape, and the purpose of that is for light refraction, because when it changes shape, it will bend light more or it will bend light less. But the point is, it's to focus the light on, we're trying to focus the light on the fovea centralis so we can get a clear image. So how do we change the shape of the lens? Well, we have to utilize two structures: the ciliary muscle, our smooth muscle, and then the structures that attach onto the ciliary muscle, we call those the suspensory ligaments. So if you're driving along on Haywood Avenue or whatever, and you can see the mountains in the distance there, and you're looking at the mountains, you're like, oh man, that's pretty cool. And you glance down and you want to change the radio station. You're looking at something far away, and then you have to look at something closer. So when you're looking at something far away, all right, the ciliary muscle is relaxed. Now, this is going to throw you for a loop, so bear with me, all right? The ciliary muscle relaxes, and because of that relaxation of the ciliary muscle, that causes the suspensory ligaments to tense, which causes the lens to flatten out. All right, normally we think when the muscles contract, all right, that will then pull on the suspensory ligaments and make them tense, and that would cause the lens to flatten. But you have to abandon that common sense, all right, where you would think that, and just go with the memorization portion. So when you were looking at something that's far away, all right, the ciliary muscle relaxes. That causes the suspensory ligaments to tense, and it causes the lens to flatten. Now, when you glance down at the radio to change it, now you're looking at something closer than 20 feet, right? That's going to cause the ciliary muscle to contract and tense, and then that causes the suspensory ligaments to kind of slacken up a little bit. They become less tense. And then that allows the lens to become more spherical, kind of rebounds into that shape. That process is called accommodation. Again, I'll go over this in more detail in lecture, so don't worry if you don't quite grasp that. All right, just a couple more structures here that I want to talk about quickly with the eye. All right, we have our vitreous humor. All right, that's that permanent, all right, goo that sits in the posterior cavity that's behind the lens. All right, this job for this structure is to maintain the shape of the eye, and it helps to push the retina against, all right, the other tunics. You've heard of a detached retina. That's quite unfortunate. Well, the vitreous humor helps to prevent that. All right, in addition to helping to keep the shape of the eye, all right, the vitreous humor helps to keep the retina flush against the other tunics there. The aqueous humor, all right, that's that transparent, watery-like fluid that's found in the anterior cavity. That's going to be in front of the lens, right? And so we're constantly producing this, but we're constantly draining it off. And its job is going to be to nourish our lens in the inside of our cornea, but also to provide plenty of oxygen, call that oxygenation, to those structures too. So I'm going to talk to you about the aqueous humor, how we produce it, and then how we drain it off. So you remember we were talking about that second tunic there, the vascular tunic, and we found out, right, we had the ciliary processes, right, that were located in the posterior chamber there. And so the aqueous humor gets produced from the capillaries inside the ciliary processes. Or we've seen that kind of before, like, you know how we talked about the cerebral spinal fluid being produced by the ependymal cells, and they were filtering out the capillaries. Well, the aqueous humor is filtered out by the capillaries in the ciliary processes. And so that creates the aqueous humor. And so it gets produced in the posterior chamber. But here's what happens. It circulates into the anterior chamber through that opening of the pupil in the iris. And so it circulates into the anterior chamber, and then it drains out of the anterior chamber through that little hole that I was showing you before called the sclerovenous sinus. And this is a little hole, all right, that's located, all right, I'll show you here in a second. In fact, I got a picture of it. Oh yeah, perfect. Okay. It's down there. It's located where the cornea meets the sclera there. And so it'll drain it out, much like how we talked about cerebral spinal fluid there in the arachnoid villus. And so unfortunately, if there's something wrong with the sclerovenous sinus, then you can get glaucoma. And that can be an issue for us. So this picture here, again, let me zoom in. All right, so back here, we'll go to our little eye here. Here you can see, here's that posterior cavity. The anterior cavity is up here. And then the anterior cavity is broken up into the anterior chamber. That's from the iris to the cornea. And then our posterior chamber, that's going to be from the lens of the eye to the iris. But all of those, both the anterior and posterior chambers are part of the anterior cavity. So in the posterior chamber, that's where we're going to produce our aqueous humor. All right, so the ciliary processes are going to produce that aqueous humor. It's going to circulate through here. It's going to travel from the posterior chamber into the anterior chamber right here through the iris and circulate through the front here. And then, all right, it drains out through the sclerovenous sinus. If this gets blocked up, you'll see this little angle here. So we have open angle and closed angle glaucoma, and that has to do with if the structure is getting pushed up against, all right, another structure, it can cause that to get blocked off, and then you can start to get an increase in pressure in the anterior chamber, and that can cause glaucoma. All right, so here we're looking at some of the extrinsic muscles of the eye. And there's 7 of them. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of them today. Here is the lateral view, and you can notice you have a couple muscles here. All right, you have a muscle on the side of the eye called the lateral rectus. The one underneath is the inferior rectus. The one on top is the superior rectus. Now, we've already talked about the superior oblique because when we were talking about cranial nerve number 4, the trochlea nerve, that's the only muscle that cranial nerve innervates is the superior oblique. Remember the one that had the tendon that went through this little pulley-like system and then attached onto the lateral superior portion of your eye? All right, that's the superior oblique. That's one of your extrinsic eye muscles here. On the medial view, you can see the medial rectus. Then there's the superior rectus again. All right, then our inferior rectus. And you can see our superior oblique muscle. You can see a little bit of the inferior oblique muscle here in the bottom portion there. Now we remove the eyeball, and you can see where all these muscles are. Rectus means straight. So the superior rectus is right above on the top part of the eye. Inferior rectus is right below, since we're near the nose. The medial rectus is over here. The lateral rectus is over here. But you'll notice the superior oblique muscle is superiorly medial to the eye. And then the inferior oblique muscle, that kind of does a goofy thing. It starts on the medial side, it comes up underneath the eyeball and wraps onto the inferior lateral portion of the eye. And here you can see all those muscles in position here. All right, perfect. We'll stop here and we'll start to do a little bit of labeling here. All right, let's go ahead and pull back up. If you have your atlas ready, we're probably not going to make it through all the eye structures, but I want to start a little bit so we're not overwhelmed here. So how perfect. We're going to talk about, all right, some of the external structures here of the eye. All right, so what you're seeing here is an arrow indicating your upper eyelid. We refer to that as the superior palpebra. And it's great because you can see this muscle that's attaching onto it. If you remember the name of that muscle, remember the levator palpebrae superioris. That's the muscle that helps to elevate your eyelid. We'll label that in a second here. All right, there's your lower eyelid, the inferior palpebra. Then where your superior and inferior palpebra meet together, all right, by your nose, that is called the medial canthus or the medial commissure. All right, we were referring to it as the medial commissure just when we were going over our notes there. Then you can see on the lateral portion, we have our lateral canthus or our lateral commissure. Again, that is where the superior and the inferior palpebrae meet one another. All right, so the covering to your eye, except for the cornea, right? So the covering of the white of your eye, the sclera, is referred to as the ocular conjunctiva or conjunctiva. Now we're looking at it from the inside. All right, now we'll see the lining of your eyelid. That is the palpebra conjunctiva. So if you're taking the test and it asks you to name the lining, you need to refer to the lining as the palpebra conjunctiva. Those lines that you're seeing there, those are the tarsal glands. Those are those sebaceous glands that are going to be producing that secretion to help protect, all right, your eye, the tarsal glands. All right, there's our lacrimal glands sitting on the superior lateral portion of your eye. That's going to be producing the lacrimal fluid, all right, which is going to help clean and lubricate and nourish the eye, protect it from all the bad things. All right, so that's the lacrimal gland. Then you can see the lacrimal ducts. So you'll see this gray line here, and then you'll see these smaller, they're kind of hard to see, right? The actual, I don't know what color you would call that, peach, orangish, or whatever, that's the glandular tissue. And then anything that's like a gray, right, that will be the lacrimal gland ducts. Here you can see that pinkish structure here. That's the lacrimal caruncle. That's where all your eye boogers collect in the morning. So you can see this little black dot here and here. You don't need to know this, but I just wanted to point that out. Those are the lacrimal puncta. Those are the openings, all right, for the drainage component of your lacrimal apparatus there. So here's that tubular system that's going to drain from the puncta. This is the superior lacrimal canal or the superior lacrimal cannuliculi. Then right below it is the inferior lacrimal canal or the inferior lacrimal cannuliculi. So both the superior lacrimal canal and the inferior lacrimal canal are going to drain into the lacrimal sac. Then after that, all right, any of that lacrimal fluid is going to drain down into the nasal lacrimal duct. And then there's an opening in your nasal cavity in which the lacrimal fluid can drain into the nasal cavity. And our nasal cavity has plenty of mucus glands there. All right, so it'll mix with some of the mucus and you swallow it down. Or you can spit it out. It's up to you. All right, there's our levator palpebrae superioris muscle. I love the name of that muscle because it tells you exactly what that muscle does. All right, the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. You can see it from this angle. Unfortunately, this image is not in your atlas, but it is the most superior muscle here in the orbit for the eye. All right, and then you can see it here from the lateral view. This is the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. You can see it's right up top here. In case you're wondering which view is what, this is the lateral view. I know this because I can see the lacrimal gland here, very prominent, and that's going to be in the lateral side there of the orbit. So just below the levator palpebrae superioris is the superior rectus muscle. When you contract that muscle, you look up. That is the superior rectus muscle. And it is controlled by the oculomotor nerve, which is cranial nerve number 3. Then below the eye, all right, this muscle goes down here straight to the bottom of the eye. That's the inferior rectus muscle. Which is also innervated by cranial nerve number 3. That helps you to look down. You can kind of see it here. Unfortunately, I don't think that you have this image in your atlas. The inferior rectus muscle directly below this structure here. That is a nerve. That is your optic nerve. That is the optic nerve. Right here is where the superior rectus muscle was attached to. We cut that away. Here you can see the inferior rectus muscle a little bit better. Again, we've cut, there's the optic nerve right there. All right, this arrow is pointing to the medial portion of your orbit here, and that is the medial rectus muscle. When you contract that muscle, your eye looks in towards your nose. That is also innervated by cranial nerve number 3, ocular motor. Lateral rectus. All right, you can easy to discern because you can see the lacrimal gland right here. This muscle, when you contract, will make your eyes look out towards your ears. Lateral rectus muscle is innervated not by cranial nerve number 3, but it is innervated by cranial nerve number 6, abducens. Remember A, B, D, abduct, right? Take away. This is talking about your eye looking out towards your ears, moving your eye away from the midline. So we call that cranial nerve abducens, cranial nerve number 6. Then the muscle that sits up here in the corner, okay, that has that little pulley system there, that is the superior oblique muscle. That's innervated by cranial nerve number 4, trochlea. Trochlea means pulley. All right, superior oblique muscle. Then on the underside here, you can see the inferior oblique muscle. That's innervated by cranial nerve number 3 on the underside here. This little slide here just shows you which muscles are innervated by which cranial nerves. There's this little formula here that I usually use, LR6 SO4 over 3. So lateral rectus is innervated by cranial nerve number 6. Superior oblique is innervated by cranial number 4. And then all the remaining eye muscles are innervated by cranial nerve number 3. And you can see which those are: medial rectus, inferior rectus, superior rectus, and inferior oblique. LR6 SO4 over 3. All right, I think I'm going to stop here for tonight. I hate to do that, but all things have to come to an end. So what we'll do is we'll finish up our